So. Okay, so that's live streaming. So now let me. Does it say in your corner you see it live on YouTube?
Live on YouTube.
All right, let's pray that that doesn't disappear if I make you the host. Okay.
YouTube sounds good. Now, do we? There's no way to pause. Like this is live right now on YouTube.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, and so, but it's there's a delay, so it's
Why
like.
don't you go ahead? This is great. So go ahead and get your
All right, let me open
slideshow set up. However, you
I'm actually, if you don't, I'm just gonna run and just pee quickly, and then get this show on the road.
Why don't you take your video?
Okay. Can you see that screen, Philip?
Yep, I can see it.
Great.
I'm going to go ahead and let Emmanuel in.
Okay, so, wait, this is not my title slide.
Dr. Koku, good morning.
Oh, I'm not able to share my video, Philip.
Which video?
My video.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I stopped your ask to start video. Dr. Udell, Dr.
Yo.
Good morning. Good morning.
Can you see me?
Yes, you are clear.
Great. We're live on YouTube?
We're live on YouTube.
Wow. Could we go live on Instagram too? That would feel like full circle for this project, right?
We could do a Facebook Live, but YouTube Live, I mean, I'm sorry, Instagram Live, I think is next level.
Got it.
I'm waiting for, I don't see Lonnie yet. And Emmanuel, if it looks like your audio is still connecting, or maybe it. Could you try speaking? It looks like it may still
He's
be.
frozen.
Oh, there you
Nope,
go.
not frozen. There he is.
Hi, hello, Phil. Hi,
Good
Matt.
morning.
Hi, Mike.
Hey,
Hi, Steven.
Hello. Morning, Dr.
Hi.
Koku.
How is everyone doing?
Excellent.
Thanks.
We're very excited for this day. It's been some time in the making.
Definitely.
I
Matt, how
feel
are you
like I
feeling?
need to go to my closet and put a bow tie on.
I know, I feel like I need one too, or a
I
jacket.
think so, right?
Matt looks outstanding. Matt, you
Yeah,
look,
bow ties in
Extremely.
solidarity, right?
Yeah.
I'm looking for Lonnie. I was gonna let all of the committee members in first, and then I'm gonna let everyone in at one time. I'm gonna be, I'll introduce this and ask that people, the only reason they should leave is if they get booted out, but there's no coming in and out of the Zoom. As it, treating this as if it were in a conference room or a lecture hall, minimizing that. But I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves, and then we can turn it over to Matt. Let's see, Lonnie. Oh, Deborah Glick is calling in, Matt. That's excellent. We have 40 people waiting. Let's see. Okay, I still don't see. As far as the committee and video, I'm gonna try to keep my video on the whole time, but of course, if we need to take it off for any reason, that's not a problem. Lonnie, okay, great. Dr. Tab, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hey, Lonnie.
Yeah. Hello, Lani.
Hey, Lonnie.
Hi. Hello, hello.
Thank you all for being understanding of my detailed email. I hope to keep it as close as possible, but I just wanted to take a moment, just the 6 of us, to say how much I appreciate all of your support with Matthew. And we're gonna get through this today on Zoom. And Matt, anytime you need to pause or take a minute, this is your day. This is your day, right? We support you, and we are looking forward to this defense. And this is my first Zoom dissertation defense. So Emmanuel, Steve, Lonnie, Michael, please feel free to ping me if if we need to do something differently. So I'm gonna admit everyone right now at one time. There's gonna be 53 people joining the room, and we'll briefly introduce ourselves, and we'll turn it over to Matt. So thank you all. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. For some of us, a nice 10 a.m. morning, and for others, I see a 7 a.m. morning. So good morning, and maybe in between. We're very happy to have you join Matthew Kearney's dissertation defense. I am Philip Massey, Matt's chair for his dissertation committee and associate professor in the Department of Community Health and Prevention at the Dornsife School of Public Health. I'm going to let the other 4 committee members briefly introduce themselves. And then I'm going to say one word, and then we're going to turn it over to Matt. So Emmanuel, if you could introduce yourself.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Emmanuel Koku. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology in the College of Arts and Sciences.
Michael.
Hey, everybody. I'm Mike Udell. I'm a professor in the Department of Community Health and Prevention.
Lonnie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lonnie Phillip Tabb. I am an associate professor of biostatistics in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics.
And last but not least.
Good morning, Steve Lankinow. I'm a professor in the Department of Community Health and Prevention.
So again, thank you all for joining. If there is a reason that you get booted out of the Zoom, I am admitting people back in, but please treat this as if it were in a grand lecture hall and try to limit the in and outs as much as possible. We want to give Matt our full attention. Please be sure to mute, and I see everyone is muted, and I will happily mute you if you are not. And you're welcome to have video or no video as you feel comfortable. So Matt, without further ado, I'd like to introduce everyone. Everyone is here to celebrate Matthew's dissertation defense. And Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Massey, and thank you to everyone else who's able to join me today. I really appreciate all of your support joining me today and throughout this whole process. It's my pleasure to present my dissertation, which is titled A Multiple Case Study of Geotagged Instagram Posts About Vaping. I'd like to begin just with a brief dedication to a couple of very important groups of people in my life. First are my parents, Jim, who passed away in 2001 from smoking-related cancer, and Lori, or Principal Lori, my mother, who has always been there to support me. I'd also like to dedicate this to my grandparents, Ruth and David, who even in their 90s are enduring the pandemic like true champions. And I'm very proud to tell them after today that I'll be finishing my final year of school at 34 years old. To provide you a brief background or agenda of my overall dissertation, I'm going to begin with my background and then go through some of the different elements of the study, methods behind it, and individual case studies. As I said, I'll be beginning with my background, and I'll do that right now. Tobacco product use in the US and globally is begun in adolescence. And despite decades of declining tobacco use by US adults and youth, electronic cigarettes are an emerging public health concern that have been reported on by numerous news outlets. And since 2014, electronic cigarettes have actually been the most commonly used tobacco product among American youth. Now, in the US in 2020, the most recent data tells us that 1 in 5 American youth vape on a daily basis, and this is high schoolers. And among those who vape, 85% of them use flavored vape products. Electronic cigarettes are devices that vaporize chemical mixtures, and these go by a variety of different names shown around the corner of the screen here. The product shown here is Juul, which is among the most popular electronic cigarette devices for a variety of reasons. Many young people aren't actually even aware that Juul contains nicotine, as one 2018 study found that among Juul users ages 15 to 21, 2 in 3 didn't even know that Juul pods contain nicotine. E-juice or e-liquid is a chemical compound or mixture that contains 3 key ingredients. And this is what actually gets vaporized by an electronic cigarette. And it contains an extract from tobacco or cannabis that can be either nicotine or THC or CBD, contains some type of flavoring chemical, as well as a humectant. And humectant is a preservative to keep the e-liquid in a liquid state. And shown here are a couple different examples of flavored e-juices. And as you can see, these are real confectionery flavors. They're sweet. And all of the packaging and product associates them with food items. And while these aren't necessarily healthy items, the association with food minimizes the potential harm of the products. We also know that just using the term vapor itself further minimizes the harm of these products, because vaporizers actually are not vaporizers. They're aerosolizers. They create a substance not unlike hairspray or sunscreen. And so vapor further minimizes the perceived harm of these products. Now, as I mentioned earlier, 85% of high schoolers who vape use a flavored product. And we know historically from combustible cigarettes that flavored tobacco has particular appeal to youth. Now, given the potential harms associated with electronic cigarettes and the known addictive nature of nicotine, my dissertation will primarily focus on nicotine-containing electronic cigarettes, but we do discuss cannabis and implications for cannabis vape products. So for example, the far right, shown here, Bubblegum OG, is actually an example of a cannabis vape cartridge. Media attention has greatly increased the awareness of e-cigarettes' rise among the American public, particularly rising rates of use by youth, as well as the social media marketing practices that may have fueled them. And the literature tells us there are a variety of different reasons that might explain the rise in youth vape use. And these are fueled by false perceptions, including that vaping is harmless or less harmful than combustible smoking, that vaping is effective for smoking cessation, and that vapes are not tobacco products. Now, each of these perceptions here is falsely based, and there's an abundance of evidence to support that. But how exactly do these perceptions persist, and what factors predict e-cigarette attitudes and maybe use? The literature indicates there are several different predictors, including psychosocial factors like social norms, social influences, seeing your friends vape, for instance. Also personal beliefs about how harmful you think the devices themselves are, or how likely you are to become addicted to them if you begin them. Demographic attributes are also associated with attitudes and use, and these include high-risk user groups. So in the US, young white males are one of the largest groups of vape users. Finally, we know that exposure to e-cigarette messages through both traditional media sources like television and print media, as well as new media sources like online advertising and social media, are powerful sources of exposure. In the modern era, we know that social media in particular is a very powerful source of informational and normative influence that impacts not just health behaviors, but other behaviors. Think about how often you may have seen something on Instagram and gone to purchase that product later. For these reasons, this current study will focus on Instagram as a unique source of exposure to e-cigarette related content. And I believe that this has a key role in explaining some of the ongoing trends we see in vape use in the US. Youth vape use in the US. I apologize. My study is guided by 4 key assumptions that are all, again, grounded in the literature. And essentially, I posit that exposure to pro-vaping messages on social media promotes subsequent use among young people. And Instagram is particularly important because Instagram users tend to be younger, just like e-cigarette users. And the visual and text nature of Instagram posts facilitates observational learning and development processes that are ongoing in younger individuals. Instagram is an understudied platform because most academic studies have primarily focused on use of Twitter data, which is publicly accessible and has always been. This is an example here of an Instagram post, which is one of several different types of Instagram content. There's also Instagram stories, reels, etc. This is a pro-vaping endorsement, which is a term the FTC uses to classify types of marketing material. And the user here, Vapor Bunny, is an example of an endorser. Vapor Bunny is a vape influencer, someone whose entire profile is dedicated to vape products. And there are many different ways that we could classify this. Because this is created by an individual user and not by the brand Melon Twist, this is an example of user-generated content and not brand or corporate-generated content. This is also organic, potentially, in the sense that organic means it wasn't paid for. It's not an advertisement. It doesn't have that sponsored or hashtag sponsored tag with it. So there's no clear disclosure of relationship. But I put maybe in parentheses because if we look at Vapor Bunny, the picture, she's holding melon twist in e-liquid flavor, but she's also wearing a melon twist shirt. And if you were to look in her profile, you may actually come across a post where she won both of those in a giveaway. So this type of post, user-generated content that's organic, is, I believe, an unregulated source of exposure to pro-vaping attitudes and to product promotion. And this is, again, going to be one of the real thrusts of my dissertation, is analyzing posts just like this. Now, Instagram posts or social media data in general are a really rich source of both qualitative and quantitative data that can be analyzed using mixed methods. And the key features of Instagram post data that I analyze are the metadata, which includes the username, location, number of likes, or the date, as well as qualitative aspects like the caption text and visualization. And beyond that, Instagram also is a very highly social network site, which means that it may be tough to tell here with the screen, but if you look at anything that's blue, like hashtags or usernames, the location as well, if you click on those, it actually will take you to similar content. That's the hyperlinking feature between them. And adding features like location, hashtags, user mentions are all features that therefore help your post potentially reach larger audiences. And they play into Instagram's algorithm that increases the visibility of your post in Explore tabs or in the newsfeed. Along with that, because these are linked features, if you were to click on North Philadelphia here, this user location, that would actually take you to other posts from North Philadelphia. And those other posts in aggregate comprise what's called a location-based social network. There are also, if you were to click on any of these hashtags, you would see hashtag-based social networks. But it's this unique networking feature that I think makes geotagged content on Instagram particularly worthy of further insight. Now, if you're familiar with Instagram, there are three types of profiles that you can have, or accounts. You can have a personal account that can be either public or private. You can have a professional or a business account as well, both of which by default are public. If you have a professional or a business account, you can access analytic features to your content. And in text, excuse me, in terms of what Instagram calls these analytics, they refer to these as insights, post insights. And this is a screen grab of the post insights from one of my posts. And you can see that it breaks down some really interesting metrics that aren't typically available, such as the number of accounts that I reached. That's this, unique accounts. And the number of impressions, which is an actual measure of the number of views. An impression is a view. And as we zoom in here a little bit, you can actually see that while not a majority of impressions, impressions from locations are not an insignificant source of exposure. And this further cements, why exactly geotag content is worthy of research. Much is known about the relationship between vaping and Instagram use, but there is very little that's known about the role of place-based social networks or characteristics, or how those might influence the relationship between vaping, vape use, and Instagram use. And there's a real lack of evidence about the effects of social media messaging on specific communities or networks of users like location-based social networks. And to date, most studies have relied on Twitter data or survey data, and not necessarily observational data like from Instagram, to identify relationships between content, attitudes, and vape use. Finally, no study has integrated population-level data indicators with social media posts to determine whether or not post metadata might predict attitudes or use, or vice versa. And so there are a few questions that remain based on these gaps in the literature. For instance, geographically, how is the prevalence of exposure to e-cigarette, excuse me, geographically, how is the prevalence of exposure to e-cigarette posts related with the prevalence of use of e-cigarettes? And prevalence is for the frequency. How is the number of posts associated with the amount of e-cigarette use? And online, how do Instagram communities of users, such as location-based social networks, engage with e-cigarette content? So these questions require further research. And therefore, I propose the following research question and specific aims to address these gaps. The overall research question for my dissertation is presented here at the top. How do the promotion and portrayal of e-cigarette content on Instagram relate to risk factors, risk perceptions, and health behaviors associated with the use of e-cigarettes? Now I'm going to answer this question through 3 specific aims, each of which is an individual case study that I'll present. Excuse me. The first study focuses on characterizing Instagram posts from Philadelphia and correlating them with zip code level population characteristics. Second study is a case study focusing on geotagged Instagram posts from the state of Hawaii. And I don't correlate this with actual population attributes, but I use a technique called social network analysis to investigate clusters of content. The third case looks at the entire United States, and I aggregate Instagram posts to the US state level, including Washington, DC, and Puerto Rico. And as I did in the first case, I integrate this with secondary data sets to identify relationships between the amount of Instagram posts in a state and population characteristics. My dissertation is based on 3 key theories, drawing from health behavior and communications research. Social cognitive theory is a theory that helps us to explain how exactly Instagram influences behavior. And this, one of the key constructs is called observational learning. And you can really think of it as simple as monkey see, monkey do. That you see something, you may be more likely to engage in it. Narrative engagement theory helps to explain why exactly it is that Instagram posts with story elements, with personalized features, are so important and so influential. For example, if an Instagram story contains a post where the user says, use this vape product, and you will feel like you're on a beach in Hawaii, that's an example of something that might transport the viewer or the consumer of that content. Finally, the health belief model is a health behavior theory that helps to explain specifically how Instagram posts influence health through different perceptions. And the health belief model is essentially you weigh the risks and benefits of a potential behavior before deciding whether or not to engage in that behavior. So for vaping, weighing the risks of vaping versus the benefits of vaping, ultimately will inform whether or not you'll engage in that behavior. The 3 theories inform my conceptual model for this dissertation. And throughout my dissertation, I'll be looking at some different elements of this. Post attributes, shown in the right here, will be the key content that I'm actually coding. And coding means content analyzing, going through and saying that this post mentions smoking cessation. This post mentions nicotine. And so I've got just some examples of different types of content that I might code for post attributes. User attributes are a little bit more interesting because they include information that can come from social media, like the user type, the number of followers. But because we're actually using geotag posts here, we have a location. And so we can actually correlate where a post is created with local policies, as well as those population demographics. Now, the focal relationship for my dissertation is trying to understand whether or not the amount of Instagram posts in an area predict e-cigarette use in that area, or vice versa. And In doing that, I'll actually quantify geotagged e-cigarette posts as the frequency of posts in an area. So it'll be an actual number. And e-cigarette use will be information drawn from secondary data sources like the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, or the YRBS, and the Behavior Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, which is an adult version of the YRBS. Unfortunately, because electronic cigarettes are relatively new to the market and there isn't really a lot of long-term research available, we don't know necessarily about adverse health outcomes related to e-cigarettes. Aside from the raft of respiratory illnesses in 2019 and 2020, although beyond those, there hasn't again been really concrete evidence about what the health outcomes associated with e-cigarettes are. My dissertation adopts a study design that is referred to as an embedded multiple case study with multiple units of analysis. And what this means is that I'm looking at 3 distinct case studies. A case study is an analysis of a certain context, a bounded, in this case, geographically bounded context. And so I'm looking at 3 unique cases here. In the United States, I'm looking at Instagram posts and aggregating them to US jurisdictions. In the state of Hawaii, I'm analyzing Instagram posts and I'm just focusing on them. I'm really taking a deep dive in the content. And in the city of Philadelphia, I'm analyzing Instagram posts and aggregating these to the zip code level. I've mentioned this several points, and to give you some clarification about what exactly does it mean to analyze Instagram posts, and how did I get these? So my key unit of analysis is the Instagram post. And as I mentioned earlier, there are location-based social networks and hashtag-based social networks. So if you were to go into your Instagram app or on your web browser and you were to type in your favorite hashtag, what would populate below it would be a list showing you the total number of posts created using that term. And so you can think of these as the overall sampling frames for these different hashtags. So for hashtag vape, you can see there's a lot of different groups here, and hashtag vape has over 30 million posts. And this is as of last week when I created this slide. Now, what I did was using a software called Netlytic, which accessed Instagram's API, or application programming interface. This is how you can download public Instagram posts from Instagram. I used a series of 9 search terms to scrape these public posts. And I did this at a time when that was allowed. In December of 2018, Instagram actually deactivated that access. And so Instagram and Facebook, who own them, are among the most restrictive in terms of letting individuals access their data. But as I said, I collected these posts at a time when they were available. So my methods for data collection, as I said, I had 9 search terms, and I'm just going to walk you through my overall data set here. I used those 9 search terms, and I collected about 3 million total Instagram posts. And the first step that I did was merge them all and exclude about 800,000 duplicates, and then exclude about another 800,000 posts that were not relevant. And this means that they didn't mention a vape-specific term. So if it only mentioned CBD or if it only mentioned THC, it was excluded. This left me with a sample of 1.4 million unique vape-related posts, of which 309,000 were geotagged. This geotagged 309,000 set here was the overall sampling frame from which I then sliced out the 3 data sets that I used in my subsequent case study analyses. And in Philadelphia, this meant that I began with 1,307 posts. In Hawaii, I used 738 posts. And in the United States, I used about 114,000 posts. All posts were collected between April 1st and December 11th, 2018. Across the 3 case studies, I used a series of mixed methods. I analyzed the content of Instagram posts in all 3 cases. And in Hawaii and Philadelphia, what that actually means is that I manually coded posts. So I looked at the 1,300 posts from Hawaii and the 700 posts from the 1,300 posts from Philly and the 700 posts from Hawaii. And I went through and reviewed each post individually and coded content characteristics. In the US, I used an automated program to identify posts that related to tobacco vaping or cannabis vaping. So it was a much more limited cannabis or content analysis. Then, as I described, in Philadelphia and the US, I aggregated my content analysis findings to the state and zip code level. And I used this to run regression models to try and predict what factors would predict the number of posts in that area. And in Hawaii, I used a software called UCNet software to conduct social network analysis that I helped to identify clusters of content using a visual diagram that I'll show you called a sociogram. Now, regression analysis, just to give a quick review of regression, can be thought of as the simple algebra equation y equals mx plus b. In that equation, the y is your dependent variable, and this is what ultimately is trying to be predicted. Your independent variables are all of the things that you're controlling for in that model. And in Philadelphia, I aimed to predict, after adjusting for population, the number of tobacco and the number of cannabis vaping posts per zip code. In Hawaii, it was a much more simple regression. I was just trying to see what factors predicted the number of likes. And then in the US, I again looked at what factors predict the volume of tobacco and cannabis vaping posts per state. But then, because there's also additional data sources available at the national level, I also tried to see, do posts predict vaping? And so these general models I'll walk you through as well as my findings. This study received Institutional Review Board approval as not human subjects research. Because we used public Instagram posts and secondary data from other sources, this was determined to be exempt from further review. We submitted a letter of determination of not human subjects research, which the Drexel University's Institutional Review Board did accept. Beyond that, I should say that because these are public posts, you can still access them online. Vapor Bonding is a public profile. There are no privacies of privacy or confidentiality for data that are in the public domain, like on social media. Now, I'd like to walk you through my case study findings. In the city of Philadelphia, Philadelphia is one of the top 10 largest cities in the country, but it's quite unique among them in that it is actually the poorest of the top 10 cities. And it's a city where the majority of the population are people of color. Now, across other large national school districts, the median percent of high school students who vape is 14. And in Philly, that's actually about half that rate. So Philly is doing a little bit better than other school districts. This also carries through with cigarette smoking, and many attribute it to high tobacco excise taxes and local ordinances in Philadelphia, driving down these tobacco use rates. Nevertheless, there are demographic disparities in vape use. Being white and male in Philadelphia are strong predictors of youth vape use, for instance. In Philadelphia, I used an embedded mixed method study. I analyzed a series of 1,307 posts using geospatial methods and GIS software. And I used negative binomial regression to try and predict what factors were associated with the number of tobacco and vaping posts per zip code. And on a subsample of those 1,300, I analyzed the content of posts. And so although I began with 1,307 posts, I was actually only able to code about 500 of them due to broken links. And I compare my findings from both of these analyses simultaneously in order to interpret overall the Philadelphia context. What we found in analyzing Philadelphia posts is that the vast majority of vaping posts in Philadelphia are pro-vaping. Devices are often marketed as very sleek and customizable devices, like this one shown here, where you can change the faceplate, you can change the color. We saw that 7 out of 10 posts were created by commercial users like vape shops or by influencers like Vapor Bunny. When posts did show people, they tended to show white males. And this is a group, again, that we know is a high user risk group for vaping in Philadelphia. Finally, we saw that 1 in 5 vape posts, including those from commercial users, included a nicotine warning label. The reverse means that 80% of posts did not include a nicotine warning label, and this is excluding even cannabis posts. And finally, 1 in 10 posts mentioned cannabis in Philadelphia. Largely, this was medical marijuana or hemp-derived CBD products. When we look across the zip codes of Philadelphia, at the left here is a choropleth map showing you the distribution of posts. And this is broken down into quintiles. So the colors correspond with the amount of posts in that zip code adjusted for population. And red is the highest and blue is the lowest. And if it's gray, that means there just wasn't enough data available, unfortunately. And what we see in looking at, zip code level characteristics, on the right side is what's called a forest plot. And a forest plot is a visualization of a regression model. And what it means is that this line in the middle here indicates 1.0. And in a forest plot or in a regression, if the IRR, which stands for incidence rate ratio, if that is above 1, that means that there's a positive relationship between that characteristic and the outcome. If it's below 1, there's a negative relationship. And these horizontal bars here indicate the 95% confidence interval. And so if that horizontal bar crosses this line in the middle, this 1.0, that indicates that it is not statistically significant at the alpha at 0.5 level. So that being said, we can interpret this forest plot and we see that there are 2 significant associations. The first is a positive association between males and vape posts. And so the interpretation of this is that zip codes, as the percentage of male residents in a zip code increased, the incidence rate of vaping posts increased by 2.83 times. And this is statistically significant. And so this means at least that there's an association between the percentage male in a zip code and the amount of vaping posts. Now, POC stands for people of color. And there's a negative relationship between the percentage of people of color in a zip code and vaping posts. And if we look at the reverse of that, that means that there would be a positive relationship among white residents. So taken together, our tobacco vaping regression model here shows that vaping posts were more common in zip codes with higher proportions of males and lower proportions of people of color. Looking at cannabis, we have the same 2 types of visualizations here. On the choropleth map on the right, we can see, or on the left, I'm sorry, we can again see distribution. Now, there was just 1 in 10 posts about vaping were about cannabis, and so you can see there's a lot more missing data here. But we were still able to identify some relationships between zip code populations and the amount of cannabis posts, particularly relating to the ICE score. And the ICE score stands for the Index of Concentration of the Extremes. And this is a measure actually created by Nancy Krieger's lab at Harvard. And it's a measure that represents essentially income disparities. And in this, although there's a negative association between ICE score and vaping posts, that actually suggests that it's negatively related with less income disparity. Or if we kind of take the reverse of that, cannabis vaping posts are more common in zip codes that have greater income disparities, greater concentration of incomes at the extremes. Aside from that, we don't have any other significant relationships in this model, so that's the primary one we'll discuss. Moving on to the second case study, looking at Hawaii. Like Philadelphia, Hawaii is a very unique state. Although it's small, it's actually one of the most racially diverse states in the country. 3 in 4 individuals in Hawaii are people of color. And if we look at vaping among Hawaiian youth, 1 in 3 Hawaiian high school students vape. And this is slightly slower than the national average. But again, as we saw in Philadelphia, there are racial and ethnic disparities in terms of who uses vape products. And what we see in Hawaii is that Hispanic and Latino and NHOPI Hawaiian youth are more likely than their peers to use vaping. NHOPI stands for Native Hawaiian or Other Pacific Islander. So these groups are at higher risk. Similar to Philadelphia, I used an embedded mixed method study here where I analyzed the content of posts, and I looked then in a quantitative model using regression to understand exactly what factors predict the number of likes in this model. And in addition, I'm going to show you some network sociograms that outline potential clusters and characteristics among Hawaiian posts. It's worth noting that out of the 738 posts that I collected from Hawaii, fortunately, only 366 had working links and could be fully coded. In Hawaii, we found that local flavors, cultural references were very common. About a third of posts mentioned something specific to Hawaii. Just like in Philadelphia, nicotine was rarely mentioned. 4 out of 5 posts didn't mention nicotine, including commercial posts. Finally, commercial users and influencers again dominated the scene. 73% of all posts were created by these user groups. And before I go into the network analysis, I just wanted to show you a little bit about the codebook. This is the actual codebook. This is the tool I use to categorize the content of posts. And all of these categories were organized into larger domains. And social network analysis takes all of these categories and it includes them as individual variables, and it attempts to identify clusters in them. And that means that there can identify clusters between image features and different types of who is shown in posts. And it does this in a single model. And it really is quite interesting to see that visualization. So this is one of those models. This is called a sociogram. And for the purpose of my presentation, I only showed you posts here from commercial users and vape influencers and ambassadors. Commercial user posts include posts from vape shops, and these are the red dots. And the green dots are the vape influencer posts. The blue squares represent the codes that I was just referring to. Now, through an iterative process, I reduced the overall number of codes from that larger code book to just the important ones shown here. And what we can see in doing this is that there is a clear cluster in the middle of this sociogram of both vape users, vape influencers, and commercial users. But on the outside, at the periphery, we see that it's almost all commercial user posts. And this may be because of what types of content the different user groups here include in their posts. So when I resize the blue nodes by what's called degree centrality, it's a social network analysis metric, we see that there are 3 key codes, 3 key content characteristics: device appeal, social acceptability, and flavor. And posts at the rim of this network seem to be those that only mention either device appeal or flavor. The ones in the middle seem to be those that mention either both or all 3 of these characteristics. And so this suggests at least kind of what features are really central to Hawaiian vape posts. And so we really see these 3 different characteristics emerge from all of these other that we can see here in terms of clusters. Now, I'm resizing all of the same nodes. This is the same diagram. I just resized the nodes by the number of hashtags in a post. And we see here this circular middle kind of core, if you want to think about it, is really populated with posts that have more hashtags. So having more hashtags is associated with more centrality. Posts at the rim are smaller. They have fewer hashtags. And this suggests that if you want to create a post that's more central to your network, you need to use something that's going to actually include a variety of different hashtags. And so if you think of Vapor Bunny's post from earlier, there was probably 20 hashtags included in that. And so this is what I mean when I say hashtags can increase the visibility of your post. Finally, I resized the posts by the number of users, number of people who the person who created these posts follows. And so we see that vape shops, these commercial users, tend to follow fewer users than vape influencers. And maybe this explains why influencers are more central to the network. They follow more people, they're exposed to more content, they can therefore share more content themselves. Now, this is my Hawaiian regression model. And in this model, this is a multi-level regression model. And the model parameters that I have for this, the outcome is the number of likes. And what I've included here are, it's multi-level because I've got characteristics from the users, okay? And as we can see here, the strongest predictor of likes is whether or not a post is created by an influencer or an ambassador. I looked at post characteristics. This was based purely on text. And we can see that whether or not having a link included was the strongest predictor of text characteristics for number of likes. And finally, image characteristics down here at the bottom. You can see that having people present in an image was a very strong predictor of likes. So taken together, in public health, if we wanted to learn from this, perhaps we would want to create anti-vaping material from influencers that has links and that shows people, if we want to reach the same level of engagement that these posts did. Now, my third and final case study for the US. As I mentioned earlier, there's been a surge in tobacco use driven by vape products in the US. And this could be because there's very low awareness of the nicotine products in these devices. Although there's been regulation at the federal level that will be coming out next year about online purchasing, there is currently no legislation that prohibits marketing or advertising for vape products, similar to as there's for tobacco cigarettes. If you think in the wake of the 1998 Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, there was a variety of youth-oriented tobacco marketing practices like Camel Joe that were banned. And that's not the case for vaping. In addition to that, we have a real evolving national landscape of cannabis legality. Now, shown here on the right is a post. This is a group called CASA, which is the Consumer Advocates for Smoke-Free Alternatives Association. These are pro-vape advocacy groups, and they are one of many. And they are very vocal and very voluminous on social media. And you know, with all of this in mind, this is really just further kind of background for why it's important to look at national social media about vaping. In this study, I used a slightly different study design. I used a concurrent triangulation mixed method study. I aggregated Instagram posts or jurisdiction level and interpreted them similarly. Looking at cannabis vaping posts, this is a choropleth map showing you population adjusted volume of cannabis vaping posts per state. And there's an average of 5.7 posts per 100,000 persons per state. And the top 5 states are shown here at the left. The top is Nevada. And one thing you may note about these different states is recreational cannabis is legalized in all of them. Looking at tobacco vaping, we see a slightly different distribution. There are, on average, more posts about tobacco vaping, so almost 5 times as many posts as there are cannabis vaping posts. And as we see, looking at the top 5 states, Nevada actually is again the top for tobacco vaping, although the others, there was some variation. Interestingly, Hawaii was one of the top 5 states here, which was interesting because we analyzed them in detail. Now, I was able to look at both adult and youth vaping at the national level because there's our data sets available that pertain to adult and youth vape use. And looking at cannabis vaping in the US, we saw significant associations between Hispanic residents or states with more Hispanic populations and states with less residents living in poverty. We also saw a positive association between states with recreational cannabis and the amount of posts in that state. And looking at tobacco vaping posts, we saw similar relationships as with cannabis. Tobacco vaping posts were more common in states with more Hispanic residents, but with less residents living in poverty. And this was among the general population. When we look at the youth population specifically, we see very interesting data. Tobacco vaping posts were more common in states with more males and where there were more youth current vapers. We also saw an association, I also saw an association between states with more Hispanic residents, although this was not statistically significant at the alpha 0.05 level. And similarly, we saw a negative association between smoking in a state and vape content. So these potential disparities at least help us to quantify potential exposure to e-cigarette content on Instagram. Now, I'd just like to go through some of my findings and conclusions here and recommend future research. On Instagram, I found 5 key findings about the content. There's overwhelmingly positive portrayal of Instagram posts. Vaping was shown to be healthy, socially acceptable, and in many cases, there were discounts and incentives offered to promote these products. In Philadelphia and Hawaii, Instagram posts reflected known user demographics. We also saw that in those 2 locations, content was very much locally tailored for those audiences, showing the beach in Hawaii, showing the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. In Hawaii, at least, influencer posts got the most likes, and this is important for public health advocates for tobacco control programming. And finally, nicotine was rarely identified in products. Looking at the intersection of content by place, in Philadelphia, we saw associations between tobacco vaping posts and male and non-Hispanic white zip codes, as well as zip codes with lower educational attainment. And when we look nationally, though, we saw some similarities there in terms of education and gender, but we saw that tobacco vaping posts were more common, though, in states with more Hispanic persons. Looking at cannabis, we again saw some similarities. Cannabis vaping posts were more common in Philadelphia zip codes in US states with more males. But there were also some differences in terms of race. With these findings in mind, I have recommendations at different levels of action. For the federal government, I believe that it is important and imperative that they adopt very clear e-cigarette marketing regulations, perhaps like those based on the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement. Federal government also needs to begin enforcing the FTC guidelines about what type of content on social media is actually marketing. Social media platforms need to remove old content. Like that I analyzed in my dissertation, a lot of that is still active on social media, like those posts from vape shops without nicotine warning labels. Social media platforms must also more stringently address organic endorsements that aren't necessarily monitored through traditional advertising channels. At the state government level, states need to adopt the FDA and FTC guidelines and create actual state legislation to make it enforceable. And states need to further define e-cigarettes as tobacco products. Even though e-cigarettes contain nicotine and nicotine makes it a tobacco product, this doesn't necessarily mean that all states classify them the same way for tax purposes and for other as well. Local governments can enforce these different pieces of legislation, and perhaps they could use the license and inspection departments to actually carry out that enforcement. But they can also work with the vape industry in their area and provide trainings for them about what they can and cannot post on social media. And finally, for social media or for public health, departments and advocates and researchers, it's vital that they conduct surveillance of social media, like this dissertation, use that to generate evidence about potential disparities, identify them. And if we can't identify disparities, if you can't measure it, you can't change it. And finally, they need to think about how they might be able to design some kind of programming that can work with influencers and collaborate with them for the better. And finally, across the board, I believe there is a huge need at multiple levels, the federal, state, and local government level, to protect data access rights for social media data. And social media platforms should take the step by making that data publicly accessible. Twitter does this, Facebook does not. And although I analyzed data that was publicly available, I could not right now collect the same type of data that I did for my dissertation. This has never been more important because although vaping rose in the US until 2019, data show that between 2019 and 2020, tobacco use and vape use actually dropped. But we have to take this with a huge grain of salt, bearing in mind the pandemic and the stress that that put on virtual learning environments. And we should expect that as youth return to in-person learning environments, that we could see a resumption in the increasing trend in tobacco use once everyone is back in school settings and no longer doing virtual learning. And it may be even possible to think about how we could target, help maybe prevent that rise through social media marketing, social media anti-vaping programming. My study is not without its limitations. I have some issues with the external validity in that my findings are only generalizable to the geographies where these analyses were set. There's potential for selection bias because I analyzed public and not private posts. I also analyzed geotagged posts, and therefore non-geotagged posts or private posts could be different. This is all self-reported data and it has to be taken with a huge grain of salt. Instagram users could have been, as the term is used, catfishing. They could have been putting fake information out there. Finally, we must be really careful to draw conclusions at the national level or the state level based on findings from the opposite. This is called the ecological or atomistic fallacy. We can't make conclusions about US states based on findings from Philadelphia zip codes. And we can't make findings for Philadelphia zip codes based on US states. At the same time, there are several strengths to my study. I believe because I found very similar results in Philadelphia and Hawaii, the high reliability of these results indicated a strong internal validity. I used mixed methods that included a variety of quantitative and qualitative approaches, and therefore this provided a really comprehensive content analysis. And finally, I used a multiple case study design. And case studies allow for more concrete and more contextualized findings that could be transferable to other case settings. I believe that my dissertation contributes meaningful insights towards the development and implementation of tailored interventions and regulations. And I believe that many of my innovations are grounded in the methods that I used, such as using geotagged Instagram posts and integrating them with secondary data. And I'm really eager in the future to pursue how this could be applied in different opportunities in research. For example, looking at vape content from other platforms, looking at geotagged content about other behaviors, and maybe looking at misinformation in location-based social networks. Reducing the prevalence and health impacts of misinformation is a critical public health role, whether is it about vaping, vaccination, or any other health behavior. And research into health communications on social media can be leveraged to help promote health equity in local contexts. Because health equity means having access to community-centered information and community-centered evidence. And with that, I'd like to thank just a couple of people. My dissertation committee members, Dr. Philip Massey, Dr. Lonnie Tabb, Dr. Stephen Lanknow, Dr. Manuel Koku, and Dr. Michael Dell. Thank you so much for all of your feedback throughout this entire process. Thank you to the CHIP Department, Community Health and Prevention Department, to the Dornsife School of Public Health. I'd also like to thank all of my PhD, formerly I was DRPH student peers, my uncle, George Weiss, my godfather, and lifelong supporter of my education. Thank you so much for all the opportunities you've afforded me. To all my family and friends, I couldn't have done this without you. Last but not least, there's one person I really couldn't have done this on, my copy editor, my proofreader, my cheerleader, my personal chef this last 4 months. Patrick, thank you so much. I love you, and I really appreciate everything you've done. Thank you all so much. With that, I'd like to take just a couple questions.
Everyone, please join me in doing a virtual clap. Sending your congratulations through chat. Matt, imagine the crowd is going wild right now. Excellent job. We are going to spend 5 minutes opening it up to the public right now, to everyone on the Zoom call, all 75 participants. Way to go, Matt. You can draw a big crowd. Any questions? And if you have a question, you can either raise your hand on Zoom, you can unmute. I can help you unmute, or you can put it in the chat, but we're going to limit it to 5 minutes. And then we're going to ask everyone to exit the Zoom room. So any questions from the audience?
This is Allison. Hi, Matt. Great job. I have a question. You said that Instagram and Facebook changed their way of you being able to do your research. So are there any other tools or systems or anything that you could now buy to help you get those same results from a different future study?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Allison. You can always buy this information. Is unfortunately the case. As academic researchers, I think it's really vital that information like social media data is publicly accessible. And that doesn't mean that it has to be identifiable. They can de-identify it and still provide access to the data. But right now, there are ways that you can purchase data from your own account on Instagram and Facebook, but it is not necessarily the case for other people's accounts. So unfortunately, that's the case. Twitter, all of these other platforms you can, but on Facebook particularly, they're very protective of data. So they allow you to get your own. They won't allow you to in mass export others' data, even if you want to buy it. But
Got it. I wasn't sure if there was any
manually.
like Wall Street Journal, not Cision, but any of these other like, so not like just so you could discover it on your own in the future, but just it's too hard. They just block everything now.
They do, yeah. And a lot of studies, I mean, there is still research going on in Instagram and Facebook related platforms and other private platforms, but it's all through what's called manual extraction. So taking screenshots of things and then coding those. And that is a very labor intensive process. I was lucky enough that in my data set, the 3 million Instagram posts came out in Excel files, not in PDFs, but you can still do that. But yeah, right now, if you don't want to spend money, you have to put in the time, unfortunately.
Debbie, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, the biggest compliment I can give you is that my 7-year-old daughter walked over and said, "Wow, your meetings are usually so boring. This sounds interesting. Can I listen?" And she sat down and listened. I think I have I have kind of a question and then a concern, not with Matt, but just in general. Is one, I noticed I believe you did 2 states. Was there a reason you didn't do more states? And maybe you addressed it and I missed it because I have 4 kids running around being very loud.
No, it's a great question. I chose the states. Yeah, I would have loved to do all the states if time allowed, or if I had funding for that. I did apply for external funding to try and code all the states, but I wasn't awarded that. So given like that I had to do the manual coding for it, it was just a matter of parsimony and time. But
And
that being said, I think that I have done a couple other in order to analyze both the text and image, that's very time consuming. You can create code that analyzes text much quicker. And in like what are called formative analyses before my dissertation that informed this work, I used text analyses for posts from Pennsylvania, for posts from Connecticut, to try and get a general sense of it. But no, a future step for this would be to code every single state, all of the images in them. That would be like my big dream for this.
right. And okay. And then did you pick Philly and Hawaii because they seem to have a strong people of color component?
So it actually in Philadelphia, it began just because I live in Philadelphia, and so I wanted to kind of, being in the Department of Community Health and Prevention, to really do something that was grounded in my own community. Hawaii was actually serendipitous because Dr. Massey was working with someone in Hawaii working on a grant proposal about vaping in Hawaii, and they actually were like, "Oh, you're doing your Instagram about vaping?" I said, "Well, I have some posts from Hawaii," and that actually became my second paper. We looked at those posts for this grant, and then over time it's like, wow, that's actually quite interesting. I think I'm going to do it for my dissertation. And I did.
And my concern is the fact that I don't think Facebook and Instagram, who I think are now the same company, have any interest in regulating this at all. I think they're very happy to let it run. And then it can be very hard to put things through the government and slow. And then there's lobbyists fighting against it. So I guess my concern that I don't expect you to answer is changing this, I see as very challenging.
It could be. I mean, it's yes and no. I mean, it's all a matter of priorities and willpower behind it. But I think if anyone here uses Instagram, you can't even post a picture of something related to a vaccine without getting a warning label attached to it now. Instagram, Facebook, these tech companies have the ability to analyze images automatically. And I think it's well within their capability to add, like, that you get those little like, oh, like you're typing about COVID, here's more information, click this link. I think it'd be very feasible for them to do that for vaping as well, particularly knowing that it's got such known youth appeal to it. I will mention though, for Instagram, interestingly, Instagram is considering creating a entirely separate social network it's like Instagram for under 13-year-olds. And they're hoping they're going to create this walled off community that, this content might either, which I think is equally problematic. I think that, in the marketplace of ideas, removing ideas maybe isn't the best way. It's better to educate people so that when they encounter ideas, the ideas don't sink in, the bad info doesn't sink in. But yeah, I think that Instagram and Facebook could always do more.
I'm done.
I want to thank everybody so much for joining this public part of Matt's dissertation defense. If you have a related burning question, maybe you can drop it in the chat right now, and we'll circle back to that later. But at this time, if you're not part of the committee, I would invite you to leave the Zoom room. And thank you so much for joining. And Matt, I don't know if you want to thank everybody for joining.
Yeah, I can't see all your faces. I would give you all a big hug if I could. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days. Thank you so much.